Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Lead Dev panel. I'm your host and moderator, Juan Paulo, and I am joined by some wonderful guests who will be talking, and they will be doing the majority of the talking, about velocity, understanding your team's velocity, how to measure, how to organize your process around it, that sort of stuff. We have some really interesting takes, and hopefully you'll learn a lot. And also, if you can teach us in the chat as well, if there's anything that you'd like to share, we'd love to hear it. We'll let my guests introduce themselves because they'll likely do a better job than myself. I'll start with my lovely colleague, Smruti, and then we'll go through Catherine and Brian last. So Smruti, take it away, please.
Hey everybody, I'm Smriti Patel. I'm head of Leap and data platform engineering at Stripe. And over to Catherine now.
Hi everyone, I'm Catherine Kohler. I'm an engineering director in the productivity organization at Netflix. Brian, hot potato.
I think you're done there. Hey everybody, I'm Brian Helmkamp. I'm the founder and CEO of Code Climate. We make products that help engineering organizations better understand what they're doing with data.
Awesome. I'm really excited to have you all. I've actually learned a lot from all of you even before this panel. I've read your work, I've seen your tweets, I've used your products. So very, very honored to have you all here. Let's start with a basic question, and we'll go in the same order as we introduce ourselves, and then we'll start switching things around, which is the understanding of velocity. Velocity is a word that we use in our industry a lot. So to ground the conversation, how about we start by describing like what is velocity, or how have you understood it, how have you learned about it, how do you use it, and then we'll start again with Smruti, Catherine, then Brian, and if we want to keep the discussion going, then I'll start actually doing my job of moderating. Take it away, Smruti.
All right. So typically when we talk about engineering velocity, a naive view is to say, let's ship faster, increase your rate of shipping, burn the midnight oil. But in the process, you can also burn out your team. So over the last 2 decades, I've worked as an engineer, a manager, and quite recently an organizational leader. I've led diverse teams of really smart, talented engineers and seen different software release cadence, be it enterprise products for 2+ years, or quite recently, deploying software multiple times a day. And through all this, I've learned and experienced 2 important concepts. One's around motivation. I strongly believe that engineers don't lack motivation. They're here to do their best work. So then the question is, how do we as leaders create the environments for our engineers to succeed and work magic? So this is where the second concept comes to mind, which is thinking in systems by Donella Meadows. That's like blown my mind away. What it talks about is think of any system as a set of elements, how they interconnect, and what the function or the purpose is. So to understand engineering velocity, you then also need to see it as a function of multiple complex interconnected systems. And speed then becomes only one of its components. So I define engineering velocity in terms of precision. That's what are you shipping and why. Speed, that is how frequently are you able to ship your software. Quality, which talks a lot about like what's the failure rate or quality of your software. And last but not the least, impact. This is, are you really achieving your business goals that you set out to achieve? So to me, when I think about engineering velocity, these 4 come to mind: precision, speed, quality, and impact.
That is a very tough act to follow. It's like the very lit up Christmas tree house with all the lights, and then the one next door that has the arrow pointing to that house, because it's like, I just tap out. But to add to what Smruti said so eloquently, I think of velocity not as number of story points completed in a sprint, but as like a vector, right? It's amplitude and directionality. Everything has to be pointed in one direction or directionally similar, but also the health, the well-being, the functioning of the team, everybody's pulling together towards a common goal and vision and delivering high quality, high value, aligned with goals, et cetera. So plus 100 to what Smruti said, but throw in the vector thing for a visual cue. Brian.
Yes. So I would agree with everything that's been said so far. I think about velocity as the ability to move rapidly in the right direction. The two words that really stand out to me are alignment and efficiency. And so if you have alignment, then that's kind of like the what direction are you going piece. And if you have efficiency, then you're able to move rapidly, and efficiency also would encompass the idea of doing that in a way which, for example, is sustainable and efficient on not just from a unit of work standpoint, but efficient with respect to the people who are engaged in that system. And I will throw out a couple metrics that we sort of look at to get some sense of some of this information around velocity, because that might be an interesting sort of segue into some of the conversation later. But what I like to look at in terms of how is our engineering velocity looking, we look at cycle time. In terms of how long it's taking to get code from a developer's laptop up into production. And we also look at deployment frequency. So, are we deploying multiple times a day like we intend to? Those are metrics that are kind of on the, they don't tell you about quality, right? So if you're deploying all the time and things break, you have another problem, and there's other ways to kind of look at that. But those two metrics are metrics that we look at the leadership team level at Code Climate every week. And we also actually report those all the way up out to our board of directors during our board meetings. I think you might be on mute, Juan.
I am. My pause to mute did not work. Thank you. Great. Not awkward at all. All right. Cool. With that grounding, I think we can move a little bit on. You've all touched in the things. Everyone is in alignment, I believe, here. So no controversy yet. None of you talked about planning poker or cards at the beginning, so I think we're all understood. I'd like to get a little bit into why it's important. So we'll go in reverse order, and then we'll actually feed a little bit the discussion, because I know velocity comes up a lot in teams, boards, CEOs love the word or the concept. Brian talked a little bit about some metrics that started coming up with Accelerate and the work from the State of DevOps report that Dora worked on, and that have helped us redefine a little bit of what we understand as velocity and what we actually measure instead of story points. Why does this velocity matter? How does it different across teams or industries? Since you have a very broad perspective, Brian, I'd like to start there, and then we'll move into the very specific team productivity, Catherine, and finally Smriti, that has both of the perspective. So let's go ahead, Brian.
Sure. Yeah. So I think probably most people on this webinar are immersed in this all the time, but what we see across industries is that really every company, whether it's a software company or not, is increasingly dependent on their software delivery function for competitive innovation and the ability to sort of grow revenues, profits, to compete and to win markets. So a lot of times it's I mean, at least for me, I know it's easy to kind of lose sight of that sometimes, that you're immersed in epics and issues and PRs and reviews and deploys and all of this stuff. But really, the businesses that we work in are depending on our engineering organizations to kind of put them over the top, and the ability to do that quickly in terms of and in an aligned way is a major driver of being able to be responsive to the needs of the business, which often come through a product team, and the rapidly changing sort of business climate that we're in. I mean, take 2020 as a prime example about how quickly things can shift, and imagine two businesses that were otherwise equal And one of them is able to deliver their features and code out to production on the same day that it's written. And another business, it's going to take a quarter to do that. And then think about how they were able to respond when COVID hit and all of those changes took root. So that's what I think about as the sort of value, ultimately driving value for the business.
I want to revisit something that we mentioned a little bit earlier around story points. Story points aren't the devil. Measuring, estimating, things like that, that is another tool in the velocity evaluation tool set. For some teams who do them, they do them very effectively, but that is not the only tool. And so if you're not thinking holistically about the health of the team, the quality of what you're producing, you can have an incredible velocity, but it could be all over the place, right? You're not actually delivering business value. In terms of our own industry within productivity, the whole point of productivity engineering is to accelerate and simplify the work of our customers who are internal developers to Netflix. And this is how productivity organizations work across the board. And so for us, we're not only taking a look at our own team's velocity to be able to meet the needs of our customers, but how do we improve their velocity by creating end-to-end experiences, holistic abstractions that take people away from Netflix-isms or other company-isms that can spend a tremendous amount of time pulling together boilerplate code. So for us, the value prop is velocity. If we are slowing down our customers, then we are the enemy. But for us, we have to measure it internally. We also have to take a look at the key performance indicators for our customers to make sure that we're doing our job sufficiently.
So as Catherine mentioned, I like this idea of the holistic view and what that looks like if you're trying to provide that value prop. And what I love about solving engineering velocity problem is there's just so many things going on. Quite typically, let's assume you've got a solid, A+ team, and your leadership practices also lean toward a healthy culture. But you're starting to see certain markers at the individual, the team, or the broader organizational level. Like, for example, in some of my one-on-ones, I started hearing discontent from some of my engineers to say, hey, I don't get how to tie the work I do to the impact it has on the business. Or some stakeholders started feeling like, hey, these features are not supposed to take so long, but why are they? Sometimes there were cases where leadership seemed to have lost trust in the team's ability to move the needle. And in fact, in some rare cases, rare extreme ones, engineers wanted to switch teams because they'd just completely given up on the team's ability. And so what that comes to mind then is if you're starting to see some of this manifest either through regretted attrition or through lower buy-in for your engineers, say promotions up levels, or through shrunken headcount, then to me, it sounds like you've got an engineering velocity problem on your hands. And it could be very different for different teams, whether it's the engineering productivity for your internal infrastructure teams or for what you're shipping to your users. And this is where I think what becomes important to analyze is to see what different stages of software development you are at, be it your planning stage. Brian talked about seeking that alignment with your users and stakeholders, or you could be in the execution and delivery phase. And in many cases, your teams could also be in different maturity or evolution, like Tuckman talks about the forming, storming, norming, and performing. Here as well, you could see how they could play into your team's velocity. For one of my teams, we had norms and rules which weren't established, and we saw that two of the staff engineers very unintentionally were stepping on each other's toes. And in some other case, there was like the ball for broader communications being dropped. So if you take a big holistic approach to it, things like team norms, roles, responsibilities also play a big role into understanding engineering velocity. And all of that makes it super crucial to understand and debug it overall.
Wonderful. Does anyone want to add anything to what we've heard? No? Cool. So we'll keep going until we start getting into the really interesting questions. Okay, so here I'm really interested in hearing Catherine's perspective first. Of course, everyone's later, but you are responsible for other people's velocity, right? For other teams as a leader of a productivity team. What are you usually optimizing for, and how do you make trade-offs? What limitations do you find? And then we'll go from that, and then perhaps Smriti, you are the customer of a productivity team at Stripe. I've seen a little bit of those exchanges, and then Brian, understanding also the connection or how you see it from a broader perspective would be really useful. So let's start with Catherine. How do you perceive those things?
So we have two different types of customers at Netflix. We have our streaming and our studio customers. And each of those groups are optimizing for slightly different things, not slightly, completely different things. Our studio customers are looking for fast iteration, and our streaming customers are looking for very, very, very low latency. And so the tools that we're delivering, we have to make sure that we are optimizing in a way that generally we can rising tides lift all boats, but then specifically go after these different use cases and create as many sort of higher level abstractions as we can, like more managed experiences for folks, so they don't get bogged down in the weeds of having to highly configure, be completely intimate with like what our security models and policies are, and all of these other, again, as I mentioned, Netflixisms. And so for us, also migrations, right? So when our customers are on a specific platform, how do we get them to a newer version of a platform quickly? So we're optimizing on our end on ways of making those migrations as easy as possible, so that people will want to move and stay on what we call our paved path. Because once our customers are on the paved path, which is sort of like a sanctioned ecosystem, then they can move much more quickly than if they are having to go in and solve a lot of these problems for themselves. And so that's how we're trying to optimize internally our own work, so that we can provide the most benefit for our end users.
Cool. Thank you. Smriti.
Right. So as an engineering manager, I think something which everyone is aware of is our work is all about like managing that complexity. And as Catherine described, do you go A versus B, and what is your force multiplier as you're making those trade-offs and what you're trying to optimize? So I go back to, what is a phase of software development you are on? If you're at the planning stage and you're trying to drive that precision about, okay, what do I really want to build? So here I typically use a principle of it is better to focus on 10 users and make them extremely happy than have 1,000 partially satisfied users. And this can sometimes involve making some really hard decisions, but the side effect of it is it also ends up having your feature set be super tuned to making that focus set really awesome at what they do. So quite recently, one of my teams shipped cloud cost observability dashboard, and we had to pick whether we should have it for the product engineering team so they could self-serve their costs better and make it widely available for them, or do we build it for finance who would have like a big brother view on who's spending what? Now, this is where we had to lean in on what the organizational culture was also about. And we went with the former. The point here is the feature set that we had to offer for product engineering versus finance was extremely different. And a year down, we actually have a lot more observability, accountability, and predictability because we optimized for our product engineering team. And this is an incomplete story because I think the counterbalance to ruthless prioritization is also adaptability, because you don't want to lose sight of what is truly important. And this is where it becomes important to train our engineers to adapt, expect goals to change, and view metrics themselves as sometimes an imperfect tool for strategic or tactical prioritization. Because what you're trying to optimize, we're always going to have trade-offs. The key here is to be more intentional about what you are trying to optimize for and why, and then sort of communicate that as early and often to your users and stakeholders. Yes, go ahead, Catherine.
Can I follow up with that? If you talk to the team about the different metrics that you're evaluating for success, some folks will want to gamify that, right? Well, we went extra hard on, commit to close in terms of like stories that we, feature stories that we got out the door, but then all of the infrastructure work, tech debt bugs maybe hit the floor. And so at a company, a couple companies ago, I had this big list of metrics that I wanted my engineering managers to report out on at the end of every sprint. And most of it was automated, so it wasn't too much of a heavy lift. And people would try to gamify it so everything looked green, but it can't. It's a trade-off, right? Like I said, if you're going in on features, maybe tech debt's going to hit the floor. If you're trying to do fast iterations to prototype, maybe your bug count's going to go up. So, you know, it's important, as Smriti said, the intentionality, these are just tools. These are just metrics to help you evaluate what to focus on. And if you're focusing on those things, are those things improving? But they're not something that you can get firing on all cylinders, because that's just ridiculous. So I wanted to follow up. Thank you.
Before we move over to Brian, Catherine, how do you prioritize for your customers when you're like in the middle of multiple teams asking for support?
What's high leverage, right? What is something that's going to drive the most business impact? Are we blocking anybody? Is this an important relationship to continue nurturing? Where are we in the software development lifecycle? Is there another solution that we can provide that's more aligned with the things that we already have in place? I want to constantly be moving the team forward so that they're not becoming mucked and mired in technical debt or support burdens or things like that. So what's going to get us out of that that hole, so to speak, so that we have more time to work on longer term initiatives? That's how I prioritize. It's never the squeakiest wheel. I don't like to enable bad behavior. And there is no bad behavior, but just saying.
Wonderful. Thank you. Brian, I think there's a lot that you can add to here. So if you can also segue us into metrics, which I know you think a lot about. Trade-offs, metrics, the balance. What
Sure.
can you tell?
Yeah. So, you know, I think when people come to us, typically they're looking at two kind of top level goals, and they generally bucket into optimizing delivery, so making sure that they can deliver their initiatives rapidly and also predictably, and then also expanding the capacity of their organizations. And expanding capacity of an engineering org can look like hiring and onboarding new engineers. It could be process improvements, which oftentimes are actually higher leverage and ROI than just throwing more bodies at the problem. It can include things like training and skill development for the people that you have in the org. Those are really the two things that we're kind of working with you know, hundreds of organizations on a regular basis. When we kind of go into that, where we always want to start is making sure that, you know, everyone is on the same page in terms of what's trying to be achieved, because you would be shocked how often you know, there are meetings that take place where multiple smart engineering leaders and product leaders, and they think they're all saying the same thing. Everyone's kind of nodding about an intent, and you really dig into it, actually they're kind of rowing in different directions, and there's no way to actually achieve a result that's going to be sort of favorable to everybody. So we actually, we'll spend time talking with our clients about sorting that out, so that we actually can make sure we're going in the right direction. And then we sort of try to figure out, okay, what are some top level goals that feel achievable if you sort of look at something at a like a boardroom level. What would be a result where we could walk into a boardroom 3-6 months from now and be able to demonstrate an improvement. Now that's inherently going to be pretty high level, right? Because there's no room for getting to a bunch of specific details in that type of environment, but it can kind of directionally tell you, okay, are things moving in the right direction? And then a lot of the sort of meaty process that we will work with teams on is connecting those top level goals. Maybe they want to switch from a quarterly release cycle to become more continuous and eventually get to weekly and then daily deployments, connecting that goal down to tactical sort of improvements that can be executed at the team level. And the interesting thing about that is that there's usually some level of indirection that's necessary for that to work. Because if your goal is, okay, we want to be more continuous, a lot of organizations are trying to do that. We want to see that show up in our deployment frequency. It's usually not a matter of kind of going to a team and saying, hey, deploy more frequently. And they've got a command that they can run that will deploy the website, and I'm sure they can sort of run that command more often. But it's sort of a matter of getting an understanding of what has been friction points that have prevented that from happening, and then kind of diagnosing that into a set of levers that can be moved, usually one or two at a time, as opposed to changing everything at once, and generate some wins and some momentum that can be sort of carried forward. So there's about 50 different metrics that our velocity product can sort of surface in different ways. And the right metrics to be looking at for an organization are typically, it's a little bit different for most organizations, depending on some of the factors that Shruti mentioned around where people are in their software development life cycle, and how mature a team is, and sort of are they optimizing for like the last 5-10% of sort of productivity that they can get out of it, or are they trying to put together something that just doesn't have springs flying out of the machine every week when somebody hits that deploy button. So there's a lot of interesting pieces of that.
Thank you, Brian. All right, so we've talked about metrics, which are a very important part. And I think it is a little unbelievable, but not really. In 2020, there's still folks who consider measuring lines of code written. I don't believe anyone in this call, perhaps in the audience, believes that is a useful metric, but it's still being used in some places. And I'd like to hear from y'all how you have come to design the metrics that you use for your different organizations, how they're valuable, why are they valuable in your case, and maybe you would use a different metric in different paint. Are story points worth it at all in context or not? Or maybe I am wrong and you do believe that we should measure lines of code or file number or other quantity metrics. How do you perceive this? Let's start with Smriti, then Catherine. Actually, no, Smriti, Brian, then Catherine.
So in terms of designing metrics, I think it depends again on something Brian said, which was how are you trying to seek that alignment early on? This is where at the planning stage, you want to define a North Star charter metric for the team. This is a lot about like, who do you want to be and what do you don't want to be? Like, for example, if you want like, hey, I want 0 security incidents, you want to start tracking 0 targets for security incidents or financial incidents or whatnot. If you are at the execution stage, I really love Dr. Nicole Fogren's book, which is Accelerate, which talks about lead time, change rate. Exactly. Thank you. Failure rate and mean time to recover, because they talk about how you drive that focus, the speed and the quality. And finally, at the last, you want to cash it in, which is the last stage, that is delivery. Because you start off with your North Star metric. This is the vision. This is where you want to be. But delivery is where you want to like start bringing it home. And quite often it could be small things like an extra UX improvement. Brian talked about what's that additional 5 to 10%. In fact, quite recently for one of my teams, we shipped something, called it done and dusted, moved on to solving a different problem. And then we did a major 1.5 retro. We realized that we actually needed to build out some adjacencies to capitalize most of the impact of that work. So figuring out how to measure and market that last bit, and whether it's in terms of additional documentation, is crucial as well. So planning, execution, and delivery each has different value from the metrics. And I can also break that down in terms of like, what's your vision, what's your strategy, and what's your tactics. And in terms of tactics, when you're doing a sprint planning and sprint level stuff, that's where some of the, the tactical aspect of how to sort of keep one foot in front of the other comes into play. And something to then think about is the counter, which is what doesn't work well with metrics, or what is it something that you want to be aware of? And this is about identifying metrics is hard and it takes time. In many cases, in one such case, we actually spent 4 to 6 weeks figuring out what the right metric was, what are the right tables, what are the data sets we wanted to build out. But that actually determined that we shouldn't have spent a quarter into what work that we were actually planning. So another thing to think about is changing metrics is often hard. And because of that, sometimes it can cause thrash with your engineers. If you keep changing your metrics too often, engineers can walk away feeling that there's too much thrash and taking the priorities themselves less seriously. So overall, I would say over-indexing on metrics can also be harmful. Catherine talked about it, which is, you tend to gamify your system. So you want to see it as something to align your North Star, and at the delivery stage, making sure that you've brought it back home. And some of the most gratifying and exciting times for engineers are seeing how their work relates in moving that North Star metric. So I use it for those different things at different times of development.
Thank you. Brian.
Yeah, so I would say one of the most common sort of anti-patterns that we see is when teams allow the metrics to become the goals. And you really need to keep straight, and this is a trap that it's easy to fall into. Even sometimes we do this at Code Climate every once in a while, and we have to pull our heads up and wait and be like, okay, is this the goal or the metric? And the reason that's really important is if you pick a goal, like you want to, ship your software more frequently, then you might have a metric that sometimes is going to work and sort of show the opposite of what you're ultimately producing. You might take an action that's going to cause some metric to, decline or show red for a couple week period of time, so that then in the future you can actually achieve the goal. And so that's how you sort of understand what decision to make as you go back to the goal. So, just some tactical tips that we sort of recommend in terms of, picking metrics. I really like to use one metric for one purpose. I think people get into trouble when they try to create one metric that has a bunch of different component inputs, and you look at it and it says, okay, well, the answer is 73.645. And you're like, well, what does that mean? Well, I don't know. I'd have to go down to all the component parts. So I'd rather just see a couple, 2, 3 metrics. I like to keep them balanced so that if you go too hard on optimizing one metric, there's another metric that then starts showing in the opposite direction. So sometimes people talk about, using quality metrics in combination with quantity metrics. And I use those terms loosely, but something that says how much are we doing and then how well are we doing it. And the last thing I'll add is that a technique that I think might be a little bit underused is looking at SLA type metrics instead of things like averages or even medians, where you can say, something like, okay, we expect in our process that this phase, we want it to take less than 3 days, and we're going to track the percentage of our units of work where the phase took less than 4 days, and we want that to be in the 90s. So kind of thinking about the way that you might set SLAs for production latency, that type of thing, you can really use that as a technique to create something that's going to feel a bit more meaningful, because ultimately, if one unit of work gets bogged down because of one special case or someone's on PTO, that's only going to affect that one unit. It doesn't really matter at that point how long it took. So those are some of our recommendations.
I couldn't agree more with both of my panelists on each one of these points. I've been on an OKR mini rant for the larger part of my career. Teams who use OKRs effectively, I think that's a good tool to evaluate success metrics around objectives. Teams don't use them effectively, in my opinion, in most cases until actually properly trained, because you have your high level objective, and then what's the key result that shows success or failure of your achieving that? And oftentimes people will just say, oh, the thing shipped. So ta-da, no, shipping is not success, right? Like, how do you measure the impact of the feature that you were trying to ship? And I really like the quality, like the measured, what did we do and how well did we do it? Sentiment surveys, sending things out, like you could hit all of your milestones and all of your targets and you can have high efficiency. But if you push that thing out to the customer and it doesn't meet the customer's needs, it meets their needs, but not in the way that they anticipated, or it's just hard to use, et cetera. Like a good old sentiment survey and doing some interviews and evaluating how do people feel about the work that you're doing is also another component that you need to be sort of acutely dialed into, particularly for a productivity team where our customer is, their happiness is our success. And so, really I agree 100% on SLAs. I used to take a look at, in this former company where I had this big list of all the metrics for my managers, it would sort of be like, what is our SLA for a P0 bug? What is our SLA for a hotfix? Like, how are we tracking to the estimates or the agreements that we have, and are we hitting them? Are we not hitting them? What do we need to sort of dial back to bring up some of these other areas? I saw a little question in the chat or Q&A about like, when do you use story points? When do you not use story points? If you have a younger team, you need to have a little bit more rigor and a little bit more process around what's getting executed. Story points is a totally useful way and mechanism to evaluate if folks are delivering on what they sign up to deliver. For more senior teams in Netflix with freedom and responsibility, we have some groups that don't use estimates at all, right? We do sort of swags, t-shirt sizes, which are a form of estimate, but it's more order of magnitude. We eyeball things, do things feel right? And then are we meeting the needs of the customer? So I was a little bit all over the place there, but I had a lot of things that I wanted to touch on.
It was great. So now I think before we jump into questions from the audience, so I'd love for people to start actually asking questions either in Slack or in Zoom. We're gonna briefly talk about metrics as surveillance. One of the hardest challenges that I had implementing metrics to my team was the concept of like, how are these going to be used against me, right? Like now, who has access to these? Why are you measuring me? We have an increasing amount of tools that measure lines of code, story points, time at meetings or not. Are we going towards a future where like we're surveilling ICs or not? And if so, then yeah, what's your perspective? Who wants to take this one first? Let's go with Brian. You volunteered, so we'll go Brian, Smriti, and then Catherine. Quickly as we grab questions from there.
Yeah, sure. So this is something that we think about a lot because we feel strongly that the happiest developers work on the most productive teams and vice versa. And as we spoke about earlier, developers inherently want to be productive, and that data enables organizations to be more productive. So this is sort of the developer comfort factor is something that really needs to be managed appropriately so that this benefit can actually be seen in these developers day to day. So there's a lot of that I would think of in terms of practices that should go along with implementing metrics that really make sure that it's going to be supportive to the individual contributor as opposed to a form of management control or as a form of some sort of weapon to wield against a team member. And it all starts with trust. Every relationship in work has trust that sort of flows through this connective tissue inside of an organization. And trust is a muscle that needs to be built up. You exercise it and it grows. So we recommend that people sort of start by thinking about what is their trust relationship in their team today, and how are they going to grow that both with and with using data as well as without the quantitative data, using the qualitative side of things. The opportunity, surveillance is an interesting word. It's obviously a controversial word at some level. I think there's another word which is really important, which is transparency. And if you can build an organization where there's a lot of trust and you add data to the mix, you can create a situation where there's a strong amount of transparency, and that's a benefit to things like understanding and communication, where people can actually have the same basis going into a meeting or retro about what's going on because everybody's able to see the same things. And that's sort of, in many ways, I think a North Star for me when I think about how this stuff all comes together.
Thank you. Smriti, or yeah, I think it was Smriti, and then Catherine quickly, and then we have some questions from.
Okay, so like Brian, I feel very strongly about this, and all my views are just my own. Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And to me, culture is what we reward and what we punish. This is more about the implicit stuff. This is things that are not in your operating principle and your values. It's like the vast expanse between what we aspire to be, but what the system incentivizes and disincentivizes. To me, when we talk about engineering velocity, it isn't about engineers checking in X lines of code. Because if that's the conversation you're having behind closed doors or now in private Slacks or Zooms, then what Brian talked about, the trust and transparency bit, to me, you've already lost the forest for the leaves, if that's the conversation you're having. So it's about engineering leaders, how we create those systems, foster those environments, nurture our teams, and to do that, then hold ourselves accountable to build and create those systems. So surveil not individuals, but look for the broader patterns, the markers, and the feedback loops, because that's way more valuable and your highest leverage, as opposed to when did someone clock in and out and when.
Yeah, I used to have a senior level manager that would walk the building on Saturday to see who was there, and that's how he would evaluate if people were producing or not. And then I had another senior level manager who had come up through the engineering ranks as well and wanted to measure lines of code, but lines of code is a bell curve. The more junior you are, the less you write. The more senior you are, the less you write, because you're mentoring all the junior people. And you're working on architecture and things like that. So it's completely ludicrous. High trust, you don't need surveillance. If you are in an environment that does need surveillance, then you better start clawing your way out of that environment, either with your feet or with you trying to change the culture. But there is some merit to evaluating if people are not checking in code at all. We have all famously heard about cases where this has happened and people are just sort of coasting. But in my perspective, I'd rather let 10 guilty people go free than to castigate one innocent person. And so it's really a balance there. But yeah, surveillance is sort of a trigger word for me. There's trust but verify, but surveillance goes a little bit too far. It goes way too far. And I'm hoping that I'm building teams that if there is a problem, someone will tell me because they want the team to be better, not because they want there to be punitive action. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think the one thing I will add this time around is with our obsession over tooling as engineers, whether we can see individual metrics or not has a huge impact on people who have experience using metrics or not. And I would like to see a lot of the tooling move more towards group and collective measures, like we can observe the system because software is a social activity, and not obsess over the individual, over how many hours does the individual put in, how many. I think the tooling can help people adopt metrics and move us away from surveillance. So that is the one bit of the controversy I'll add. Let's move to, for the next 10 minutes, questions to the audience. We actually have gotten a bunch. So whichever we can't get to here, we'll try to answer on Slack. Maybe my panelists will hang out a little bit and help us answer a few of these in Slack. And if not, we'll figure it out. First question is, how do you track these metrics other than code climate? So what alternatives have you all seen, or how do you use, perhaps question for Smriti or Catherine, since outside of code climate?
Some of the metrics that I would have would be unit test coverage, so test rails, things like that, pulling information out of there, pulling information out of Jira. JQL is reasonably powerful, and we would pump information about how we were doing in terms of our sprint commitments and things like that. Some, observability, really important to make sure that you're packing that into the things that you're shipping so that you understand usage. And then obviously customer interviews, really important as well. That's much more of a heavy lift, but important to do at regular intervals and asking consistent, standardized questions that don't lead with bias. But you can instrument, you can leverage the tools. I'm actually interested to hear how Code Climate does it, quite honestly. But that's for a later conversation between me and Brian. But that's how I did it in the past.
It's really cool.
Same as Catherine as well, both qualitative and quantitative user feedback and surveys for the qualitative aspect of what we're trying to build. I've mostly led infrastructure teams, and that's where the nuance there is around how do you track the right cohorts of your internal users. And that's why user feedback and surveys goes a long way into sharpening, or rather dulling, the sharp edges of the infrastructure we build. So we rely a lot on some of the qualitative assessment there, and quantitatively around how the team health is, how our engineering velocity is. We try to balance, the chart at the top level North Star metrics of the business value and the proposition, and balance that with what is the operational health of our systems and our people. Like, what's the pager burden like? What's the incident remediation count like? How long does it take for us to solve it? Or how long, what are the toil look like essentially to keep our infrastructure systems on and running? So we balance out both. And I think both Catherine and Brian have talked about having that holistic view, because there's always trade-offs, and it's about picking the right balance there.
Here I'll try to connect it a little bit to Brian. I have done both. I did before I was at Stripe, I was at Splice, and I pulled out a dashboard, piping in GitHub data into BigQuery. I was not in the business of metrics, right? My business was music. And so I adopted a tool. And so sometimes you shouldn't be measuring everything by yourself. So Brian, how have you seen this sometimes? Like, what things are good to measure yourself? What things should you seek out tools?
Yeah, it's a good question. I just want to plug one project, which is not a Code Climate project that some people may not be aware of. Google released in, I believe it was September, a project called the 4 Keys Project. I'm going to drop a link in the Zoom chat. And it's a system for basically building a data pipeline around being able to track some of these high-level metrics from the Accelerate book. So that's something that people may want to take a look at if they're looking for kind of a way to spin up that type of data pipeline and get that visibility. Something I just came across pretty recently. I want to share it. In terms of metrics that we track, I mean, it's quite a lot. We eat our own dog food for sure, and we are regularly iterating the velocity product, for example, based on learnings from our engineering organization. But our engineering team is not that big. We're at about a dozen or so product engineers today. So we keep it pretty, while we do have a bunch of visibility, we try to keep it pretty lightweight because we have a relatively experienced small team that is really just cranking most of the time quite effectively. I think as organizations get larger, that's where things get quite a bit more complicated, sort of non-linearly, as the lines across an org chart explode, and where some of this stuff becomes quite a bit more, needs to be a bit more sophisticated.
We have time for one more question before we have to head out. So I'll be hanging out in the Slack, perhaps answer, trying to actually get a little involved with the questions. Let's look at visibility. How do you manage visibility outside of engineering around the improvement on a team's velocity, how to share information around teams working better every sprint outside of engineering teams, right? How do you socialize these things? Adriana asks us. So who wants to take a first take? Catherine.
For me, velocity, like if you're actually using story points and we're talking about big V velocity, this is a metric that is internal to the team. It is not something that you publish more broadly. It is a relative number. It is not something that will have value for anybody outside and will be potentially weaponized. Depending how people set their story points, one team could be an order of magnitude off of the other team, but still have the same output. And so the way I look at it is, for any of these velocity metrics, with some exceptions, it's important to really put forward the jobs to be done. What is the team trying to get accomplished, and are they accomplishing those goals? Are they aligned with the North Star? Are they operating in a healthy fashion? Is what they're outputting high quality? So talking about hot fixes, talking about regressions, SLAs, and things like that, public, perfectly fine. But any internal metrics that the team is sort of helping or using to adjust and fine tune how they're operating, I think that is the business of the team. And it's not something that should be plastered on a slide somewhere. I did have a general manager ask me one time, can you just have the number of story points that your team estimates for work so that you can double your team's velocity in terms of like what they can get done and fit into a sprint? That was amazing. It was amazing, right? This is an internal number. It's not something that should be more broadly shared, in my opinion.
Brings some memories.
Yes.
Oh, yes, definitely. Trudy, go ahead.
+1 to everything Catherine said, right? There are these operational metrics which you track internally as to how the team's executing and how the team's health is. But if you're looking up and beyond, then I think about it as like, what's your 30-second elevator pitch to talk about how your work connects to the business? And for one of the teams, we were doing cloud infrastructure efficiency. This is basically the team owning a top level, company level metric when it doesn't have the full agency to actually move that metric. So seeking that early alignment from executives to say, okay, this is where we are going to head to, and this is the target, knowing fully well, what proportion of agency the team had and how much it would depend on the rest of the org was super crucial. So that's how I would think about visibility into the broader organization and exec level leadership for this.
Cool. And I don't know, Brian, if you want to wrap up, but before we do, I'll tell a small story that I found myself trying to. I had to socialize the improvements, the velocity improvements on my team, because I did have a CEO asking me for story points, and I did have an organization looking for better velocity. And so what I did was I abstracted some of the metrics from Accelerate into a organizational quarterly report where we would report like how much we were improving around our time to merge, for example, before I started using Copilot, of course. And it eventually got much better. So I was able to abstract some of these very high level metrics that in some cases would come from surveys or from actual data, and put down a report that gave the organization visibility into how fast we were moving without looking at how many points a specific engineer was responsible for or not. So sometimes we have to share those metrics, and I found that sort of level of abstraction, at least it helped me build the confidence, and then I stopped reporting on those. So Brian, I don't know if you want to wrap up with any comments on this.
Yeah, sure. I think this is a really interesting topic. My recommendations would be, if you're in an engineering role, partner with product, because product helps bridge the gap between the business and the engineering. I do think that engineering leaders should educate their executive peers and their boards around how they should sort of evaluate the performance of their entire engineering organization as a whole. And I agree that story points are a completely nonsensical way to do that. But things like deployment frequency and the uptime of the website and cycle time, I think can be good indicators for that. And your choice is either educate them on how to think about it, or you're gonna leave it to them to sort of figure out themselves, which is probably less desirable. And I think that engineering as a practice, it is a bit incumbent on us to kind of step up in this area because really every other functional area in a modern business has a higher amount of sort of transparency and information that is sort of visible at that executive level, at that board level versus engineering. So I think, that's been okay, but there's an opportunity there to push that up to the board level. And that ultimately that helps engineering leadership advocate for their groups. If you don't, coming from the CEO perspective, you can be advocating for anything you want, but if you're advocating with no data, like that's just not going to get as much credibility as advocating with data. And so I think that's the opportunity that leaders have.
I can attest to that. I used cycle time effectively to show how single threading engineers was not a great idea at the board level. So that was good. All right. Thank you, everyone. Smruti, Catherine, Brian, it's been great to share this space with you. I learned a lot. To everyone who attended, thank you for coming. I will be in the Slack channel a little bit. Please like and subscribe. Kidding. There's no like or subscribe. But please follow our panelists on their social media spaces where they'll share in our Slack channel. And I'll see you around. Thank you very much, Lead Dev. See y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Bye.
Juan.
Bye, folks.
Good
Thank
flag.
you. Take care. Bye.